starting a new section. I'm hoping we can make this one short, like 2 days, which would mean y'all would have another test over the weekend, or we could do this section and the next section and then take the 2 tests together. Which would you prefer? Do one and then, okay. I would too, if it were me, but I thought I would give y'all the option. So, the war is over. It's okay. Take the time to stop it. It happens. You know.
I forgot. I just shut it last night.
Do you need to take notes? Open it up, turn it off. It's fine.
English. I don't know what's going on in English. Okay, it's
See, if it were me, it would have been the movie I stopped watching in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I just shut it off and I didn't understand it.
Okay. So, this is going to get kind of repetitive for a little bit. Like the next 3 sections are all going to cover kind of the same time period. But it's easier to handle it in sections. And we're going to deal with the economic and political part first, because that's the part I don't like, and we're going to get it out of the way. The early 1800s are really a important time. They kind of get overlooked in American history, but because everybody wants to jump from the Revolution, you might do the war on 1812 and then the Civil War. But if it had not been for the stuff that happened in between the War of 1812 and 1865 or 1860, we wouldn't have even had a Civil War. This is when all of that stuff builds up. It's also a really big time for growth in the United States. This is when we get a lot of our canals. This is when the railroad starts. We have our Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of really cool social stuff that goes on between about 1810 and 1850. But we're going to talk about, I'm sorry, in my mind, the boring stuff first. Nationalism and sectionalism. Economic nationalism, this is where we're going to start. Just in general, nationalistic feelings were really high. And by nationalism, I mean this sense that we're all one country together, where people are starting to identify as Americans. Not, I'm somebody from Virginia. You're starting to come together with this sense that we have one goal, one government, and this feeling starts getting really high after the War of 1812. I mean, we won. We beat the most powerful nation in the world. And I know I've said that before, but we beat the most powerful nation in the world. That's pretty impressive for an upstart country. We haven't even been a country for 50 years yet. I mean, as far as country goes, that's a really short time. And we've beat them twice now. Add to that, there was a very abnormal post-war prosperity. Usually following a war, you have an economic downturn. That didn't happen after the War of 1812. And part of that was that embargo that Jefferson had placed that helped start the war to begin with. His embargo had spawned factories, which is sort of sad because Jefferson really hated factories. Remember, Jefferson wanted a country of small agrarian, of small farmers. He wanted an agrarian country. But because we had embargoed things, people started manufacturing them in the United States. And we have this burgeoning manufacturing sector coming up. Also, there was a demand for farm products because not only had we fought a war, England had fought a war. England had fought 2 wars. France had fought a war. When you're fighting a war, particularly if you're fighting where you live, agriculture always gets disrupted. So in Europe, they needed farm products. They needed food, wheat, corn, whatever. So there was a huge growth in the exports of American-grown farm production. Part of that was cotton, tobacco, and rice from the South. That made up about 1/3 of all the exports. Well, this stimulates agricultural development. It also starts a surge for land, because if cotton's going up, if tobacco prices are going up, we need to plant more, right? Because if you plant more, you can sell more. You also overwhelm the demand, but that's you hope you can get yours in before the demand goes down. And there were cheap English goods flooding the market because there were no more embargoes and Britain really needed to sell stuff. And that's going to lead to tariffs. But the biggest part of this abnormal post-war prosperity was there was an idea floating around that the nation needed a more balanced economy. Maybe we shouldn't just rely on exporting farm goods. Maybe we shouldn't just rely on commerce. We need commerce, we need farming, we need manufacturing. We need a balance of these things to make our capitalist economy work. And a lot of these sound very familiar as Federalist ideas. If you remember, the Republicans are the ones that are in office. But when President Madison gave his first annual message to Congress, what he wanted to do as president, now that the war was over, and this is his second term, were improve fortifications, establish a permanent Army and Navy, establish a new national bank, put forth protection of new industries from foreign competition, tightening tariffs, create infrastructure. And by infrastructure, they meant canals, roads, a transportation system is what they're talking about. That's going to cause some problems. And he wanted to create a national university. All of these sound very, very much like what the Federalists wanted to do, what Hamilton was pushing for. The Republicans have out-federalized the Federalists at this point. But they have realized that some of these things are a good idea. What he actually achieved, or what the country achieved, he got a standing army of 10,000 men and a strengthening of the Navy. He will get a second national bank. He will get a protective tariff. And they'll sort of start on internal improvements. The bank, everybody was pretty on board with strengthening the Army and the Navy. That was okay. What caused the controversies were the bank, the tariffs, and the internal improvements. So we're going to start with the bank. and they called the bank the BUS, B-U-S, Bank of the United States. I think that sounds weird, so I always say the bank. The Bank of the United States, they want to recreate it much like the first Bank of the United States. When the first bank the charter had run out in 1811, it had created kind of a financial mess. Well, not kind of, it created a financial mess. State banks had blossomed after 1811. They were loosely and poorly regulated. They would establish or they would issue banknotes without having hard currency to back it up. So if you had a banknote from a Maryland bank and you went in and you demanded gold in exchange for that banknote, you might get it, you might not, depending on the individual banks. There was no real regulation. There was also an issue of government funds, because when the bank expired, government funds were moved to various state banks. There was no central location, so it became harder for the government to do its own business. There were no guaranteed loans for the government, and all of these things caused problems. The paper money was probably the biggest, because that causes a boom-bust cycle when paper money is not backed by gold. They'll issue a whole bunch of paper money, all these farmers get loans, people buy things, then the bubble bursts and you can't pay it back. So in 1816, Congress adopted a provision for a new Bank of the United States. This one's going to be located in Philadelphia. The last one was in Boston. It's important because that's going to be a sticking point for a couple of people. And it incited bitter debate. And it's going to bring to the stage some people we're going to hear a lot of in the next few weeks. I turned that over before I was done with that slide. John Calhoun from South Carolina will be one of those. At this point, he is a war hawk nationalist. And he introduces and pushes the bill through on the grounds, the congressional grounds, that Congress could regulate currency. You have to have a reason. Clay is very much, or Calhoun is very much for the bank, obviously, at this point, because he thinks it's going to help South Carolina. Henry Clay of Kentucky he opposed the first national bank, but he reverses himself based on the circumstances. We don't have a national bank. It's an embarrassment. The last national bank worked. So, yeah, Clay is going to back it. Daniel Webster from New Hampshire is going to lead the opposition, mostly because he doesn't want the bank moved from Boston. That's his main complaint. Daniel is the leader of what is left of the Federalists in New England. But it pushes through, it's reestablished, it is based much like the first bank, where the government is 1/5 of the bank directors and 1/5 of the deposits. They have to be able to give the United States a $5 million loan at the drop of a hat. They have to do federal bank business for the government for free, no charges. But it is still 4/5 a private bank, and it is a for-profit bank. But it is reestablished. The second issue that they're going to fight about is that protective tariff. Now, this is in the interest of this young manufacturing section that Jefferson kind of brought into existence. There had been some manufacturing before that embargo, but the embargo really pushed it. But it's going to really affect the New England colonies, the New England states, more than anybody else. But this is a time of nationalism. There's a lot of patriotic appeal in being independent economically from Britain. So people will get on board. The New England shippers and the Southern farmers opposed the tariff. The New England shippers because they were making money bringing in goods from England. And if we raise a tariff, there's going to be less imported because, sellers are not going to want to pay the tariff. Southern farmers oppose it because they want cheap goods. They want to be able to buy that cheap stuff from England. So, but there were sizable minorities in each region that favored it, either due to patriotism or some misguided ideal, like Calhoun. John Calhoun was hoping that South Carolina in particular, but the South in general, would get into manufacturing. The cotton's raised there. Why don't you process it there? And in 1810, it's not, or 1811, 1812, 1813, it's not such a fanciful idea. I mean, we think about this time period, you think about the South, you think about plantations, the big houses, you don't think about factories. But at that point in time, the South had just about as many factories as the North did. It's just they don't start building more because cotton is king and cotton makes a lot of money and cotton fits the way everything is working right now. And cotton makes a lot of money, a lot of money, a lot more than manufacturing does, at least on the surface. If you start looking at the numbers, it's not so bad. So a tariff is passed in 1816. It's for protection and not revenue. Like I said, John Calhoun votes in favor, hopes the South would get manufacturing. It really doesn't. The third big sticking issue were internal improvements. Now, the war had highlighted the fact that we don't have internal improvements in the United States. We need roads. There's not a lot of roads. Moving troops had proved difficult. Shipping was really only on navigable rivers. So, if you get too far from the Mississippi or the Hudson or any of the big rivers, you're kind of SOL. We needed internal roads. And that was really more valid in the West than the East. Internal improvements had started under Jefferson and had been brought up, but Jefferson objected, and Madison will follow this objection, because there's nothing in the Constitution that says the government can be in charge of internal improvements. There's nothing that says they can't be in charge of internal improvements. There's nothing that says who should be in charge of internal improvements. They just don't talk about it. And Jefferson really wanted a constitutional amendment that said clearly the federal government is in charge of internal improvements. But nobody really wanted to go there. So instead, they used national defense and the postal system as their excuses for getting into internal road building, basically. And they start a national road in 1803. Well, No, it begins in 1850. 1803, after Ohio became a state, they had set aside 5% of the land proceeds to build a national road from the Atlantic to the Ohio and beyond. Because from the Atlantic to Ohio at this point is basically gets you to the frontier. And construction begins in 1850. It's called the Cumberland Road. It went in 1818. It is open from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia. If you look that up on a map, you're not going to find it in Virginia, on the Ohio River. By 1838, it has gone all the way to Vandalia, Illinois. But there are still people who are arguing that that's really not a government. The government really shouldn't be doing this. In 1817, Calhoun tries to push a bill through for Western improvements, mostly because he wants to tie the West and the South together to make it easier to transport goods, because a lot of Southerners are moving west. We're starting to fill up that new territory. So he has the support of the West and the South. He has the opposition of New England. Why? Because New England has been the commerce center. They're the ones that are shipping out everybody's goods. They don't want more roads. They don't want, oh, I think I missed a slide. I'll let y'all write that and then I'll flip over to the next one. They want to be in control of all of that. So they oppose it. It gets through Congress, but President Madison vetoes it. And that's kind of the end of it. The bill would have allowed more roads to be built and would also have allowed for the upkeep of the Cumberland Road. Would have made it a turnpike, which today would have been a toll road. So the government is really not going to get involved in transportation and for another 100 years. Until we pass the Federal Highway Act of 1916. Road building and canal building and railroad building is going to be left mostly to the states and to private individuals. They call it the American system. It's not really a system. It's more of a philosophy. Emerges at this time. And I'm presenting it because, and I'll give you all time to write this and then I'll flip to the American system slide. It's going to be important in not the next election, but the election after. Henry Clay puts forth this system, or this idea called the American system. And under this, prosperity depends on the government assuming an active role in shaping the economy. It would revolve around the bank, the tariff, and the treasury. And an idea called market revolution, kind of a transformation of the market. Not exactly an industrial revolution, but a change in how things are done. What he wanted was to take the rapid development of the Western states and territories and use that to fund government underwriting, basically, of American business. You would have high tariffs that would then be, finish. High tariffs that would then be fed back to the states, where the states could build roads, could give grants. They would charge higher prices for federal lands. Again, funneling some of that money off for the states to finance internal improvements. And then the bank would just make sure we had a good, solid monetary system. And this would sustain economic growth. All right, I'm gonna have to switch, because I'm even now getting like 2 slides behind. These ideas are percolating out there, that the government needs to be more involved and more actually hands-on in the economy. But we're going to have to wait for another election to get there. The election of 1816, I think I said that Monroe, I get Monroe and Madison. All these guys have the same first name. They're all James. They all come from Virginia. They're all planters. They're all alike. Madison's out. He's done his 2 terms. Monroe is the next logical heir to the dynasty. He was Madison's Secretary of State. He is another revolutionary figure, though he was quite young. He had fought with Washington at the age of 16 when he dropped out of school and joined the Army. He is a Virginia planter, but he is a Virginia planter with a much smaller plantation. He had studied law under Jefferson. He had served in the Virginia Assembly. He'd been the governor of Virginia. He'd been a representative in the Confederation Congress. He'd been a U.S. Senator. He'd been the U.S. Minister to Paris, London, and Madrid at different times. And he is the last of the revolutionary generation. He's going to be our last president that wears the white wig. He's the last of an era. And he's probably the youngest of that generation. He was actually more of an old Republican. He was very much a Jeffersonian, but he realized that you still had to have, like the bank, you had to have tariffs, but under Monroe, you're not going to see a lot more economic nationalism. And I misspoke earlier because I was thinking that the bill that Calhoun put forth for the road, it's actually the National Road Bill in 1822 that would have allowed the tolls. It wasn't the one from 1817. And Monroe is the one that vetoes it. But he surrounds himself with young Republicans. John Quincy Adams will be his Secretary of State, which, if you follow the pattern, that makes him the next heir apparent. Secretary of States have been becoming presidents. William Crawford becomes the Secretary of Treasury. John Calhoun leads the War Department. Henry Clay could have led the War Department, but he wanted to stay Speaker of the House. And soon after his election, Monroe takes a goodwill tour of New England that in the newspapers is heralded as the beginning of The era of good feeling, and that's what most historians refer to this time period as, the era of good feeling. Not a lot is going to, well, a lot happens, but it's a lot of positive will happen, at least in 18, 16, 17, and 18. 19, things will start going downhill. And when we get to 1920, he's going to be elected without opposition because the parties are fading. But we're going to talk about that when we get there. I don't even know why it's on that slide. Monroe had to deal with some external issues to begin with. We're far enough past the war that it's time to kind of deal with Great Britain. We've been enjoying a growing trade with Great Britain and India. India is still part of Great Britain. But there's still some issues. You know, the treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812 had basically just reestablished the status quo from before the war. It didn't settle a lot of the issues. And under Monroe, some of these issues get settled in a very positive way. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1870, which came out of an exchange of letters between the acting Secretary of State, Richard Rush, and the British Minister to the U.S., Charles Bagot, settled the issue of naval competition on the Great Lakes. They set a number for the U.S. ships that would be on the lakes to gather customs. There was no reference to the land boundary. They were more worried about the naval issues. But because they didn't really worry about the land boundary, the cooperative spirit of the letters leads us to having the longest open border in the world. There's no wall, there's no checkpoints at this point between the U.S. and Canada. We're okay with that. The Convention of 1818 will set the northern limit of the Louisiana Purchase at the 49th parallel from Minnesota to the crest of the Rocky Mountains. So on that map, it's the top of that orange section. At that point, at the crest of the Rocky Mountains, farther west is Oregon, or the Oregon Territory, and we agree to jointly occupy that area. And they also reestablished the rights of Americans to fish off of Newfoundland and Labrador and dry their catch on the beaches. That goes back to 1783. The remaining issues, trade with the British colonies, are handled with the Navigation Act of 1817, which allowed the importation of West Indies products on American vessels or West Indies vessels. So we opened trade with the West Indies, which is really nice. We have one little setback in 1818 that we close ports to all British vessels coming from colonies closed to U.S. ships. So the Navigation Act doesn't last very long. But for a while, we get to trade with the West Indies. By 1820, it's back to smuggling. But we're on a better footing with England. And even though, we beat England, we declared our independence from England, a a lot of Americans still like England, want to be allies with England. We were English to begin with. And I know that was their excuse for impressing sailors, but it kind of works for humans too. Once, you know, there's kinship there. Down in Florida, however, we have some other issues. Spain is declining, and they are unable to uphold their end of Pinckney's Treaty of 1795, which meant that they would keep the Indians on their side of the border under control and on their side of the border. And there's been a lot, the clashes with the Seminole Indians have been on the rise. And the Seminole Indians are also helping slaves escape, stealing slaves. The Seminoles held slaves, but there were also free blacks incorporated into the tribe. And they're clashing with white settlers. After an 1816 clash, a Seminole village is burned. The Secretary of War, Calhoun, called on Andrew Jackson and sent him with federal troops to settle the issue on the border. Now, if you remember, Jackson's already been to Florida once. Right before the Battle of New Orleans, he took Pensacola, illegally, but he took Pensacola, and he held it through the battle. And then quietly it goes back, because that's a diplomatic no-no. So Jackson heads south. He's ordered to pursue the Indians into Florida, but not to bother the Spanish, which technically he kind of does. He gets to Florida in 1818, has 2,000 troops. By April, he's attacked a Spanish fort at St. Mark's, destroyed several Seminole villages, and he takes 2 chiefs and 2 British merchants captive and executes them. So now he's not only messed with the Spanish that he wasn't supposed to mess with by taking one of their forts, but he's also executed 2 British citizens. So kind of everybody's mad at him. In May, he retakes Pensacola, and he establishes a provisional government in Florida. Now, back in the United States, there's a group of people that's really excited. We could expand into Florida. We could just take it. But Washington's not quite ready for that yet. And they're a little concerned over what this upstart general is doing. Madrid, on the other hand, is just pissed off because he's invaded their country. We've invaded their country for no reason. Spain demanded the return of their territory, and they wanted punishment of Jackson. The cabinet at first wanted just to pretend Jackson didn't happen and disavow Jackson's action as a rogue military leader and just pull him back. Calhoun even wanted to discipline him. But there's a problem. Jackson's the hero of New Orleans. He's very, very popular. People like him. He gets things done. And now he's taken Florida. And there are people who like that idea too. And John Quincy Adams kind of tells everybody, chill out. It'll be okay. He's already in the process of negotiating to buy Florida from Spain. And this just strengthens his hand because, now he's at the negotiating table saying, you can either sell it or we can take it. We've already done that. We just gave it back because we're nice people. So Spain will cede Florida in the Transcontinental Treaty of 1919. We agree to pay the claims of any U.S. citizens against Spain. So if you had a problem with Spain and Spain owes you money, the U.S. is actually going to pay it. This transcontinental treaty goes a little bit farther than just taking Florida, however. It's also called the Adams-Onis Treaty for the people who negotiated it. Adams tries to get Texas, but he can't. But he does get a settlement of the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. So if you look on the map, you can see it's like a fourth of the way, third of the way across the country, the orange area. Well, now it's going to go all the way to the Pacific. It's going to follow the Sabine River to the Red River to the Arkansas River, and then north to the 42nd parallel, and then straight across on the 42nd parallel to the Pacific. So now we have this is why it's called the Transcontinental Treaty. Now we have a transcontinental country. We go from the Atlantic, you can walk from the Atlantic to the Pacific and never leave the United States at this point. We're still holding Oregon in common with the British. Spain still has Texas at this point, but we can go all the way across. And by 1845, Florida is going to be a state. So things are looking good in this era of good feeling. We're settling issues, we're settling boundaries, we're growing, people are moving, which we'll talk about more later. But it's all going to kind of end in 1819. The Transcontinental Treaty is the last good thing that happens in 1819. There is a panic, an economic panic, caused by the sudden collapse of cotton products. In 1818, cotton was selling at 32.5 cents a pound, which was an exorbitant amount. But then the British find a new source of cotton. India has started growing cotton, and they can sell it a lot cheaper than we do because they're still a colony and they're supposed to be supplying the mother country with raw materials. Cotton plummets in 1819 to 14.3 cents a pound. So more than a 50% drop. This sets off a decline for other U.S. goods. It upsets the rush west as speculators have bought land in the west, thinking that, cotton farmers would be moving out there to buy it. Well, now they have it. They owe the government. And, it's on that 4-year plan, so it's a little cheaper, but they still have to pay it back, and no one's buying. You have another round of reckless banking, and this time the National Bank gets involved a little bit, which causes inflation. There's also embezzlement at the Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States. To deal with this, a new bank president is hired, Landon Chives. And Landon Chives does what he needs to do to get the bank back in order. But what he does will have some unintended consequences. So he'll lower the salaries. He postpones payments on dividends to the stockholders. He reins in this frenzy of loaning that even the National Bank has gotten in on, and he calls in all those state notes. He goes to all the state banks and wants them to pay up, which gets hard currency back into the state bank. He saves the bank, but he puts pressure on the states, on the state banks, which then turn around and put pressure on the debtors, because if I want the money you owe me and he owes you money, you're going after him. Well, that's what happens with the banks. They go after the farmers. They go after the speculators. And people get angry. And they blame the bank. Even though what he is doing is good, solid economics, you don't want to be the one at the bottom of that chain who's having to pay up. And he does save the bank. And then he retires, and Nicholas Biddle is put in charge of the bank. But now the bank has some enemies, mostly in the South and the West, who see it as targeting agriculture and targeting the farmers. The other big issue that is going to make 1819 a horrible year for a lot of people is the Missouri Compromise. And I can't get through the Missouri Compromise in 3 minutes, so we're going to stop. I thought I could, but I can't. So, I will see y'all on Friday. Y'all have a good day.
Those assignments that we had put onto Blackboard, those assignments you had put on Blackboard, are they like for this, or are we supposed to have that one?
Okay, so I think I put,
One of them was Lewis and Clark.
yeah,
I figured that was an extra credit.
that was an extra credit. The other one was a test for the last section. I think those are the only two things I posted.
I thought we already took the test from the last section.
You posted something else.
I posted something else.
I saw it last night.
Yeah, I saw. I was like, going to see, look at my emails. What is this?
Oh, hang on, I gotta take pictures. Let me look real quick because.
What time is that?
I won't shut it off until, I'll leave it open until at least noon tomorrow.
I had a lot going on, so I forgot about it.